The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of suburban silence that carried with it a false sense of safety. Manicured lawns gleamed under the sun, driveways sparkled with polished cars, and the rhythm of sprinklers was the only sound breaking the stillness. But beneath that picture-perfect image, tension brewed like a storm cloud. The Homeowners Association had always prided itself on strict control, an entitled woman with platinum blonde hair and a temper that rattled even the most patient neighbors. She believed every house, every yard, and every brick on every street belonged to her rules. The new homeowner across from her had quickly become her obsession, a man who refused to bow to her authority, who didn't show fear when she marched across lawns with her clipboard in hand, scribbling violations that seemed to appear out of thin air. Him, nor the calm confidence with which he dismissed her demands. She should never have had gossip, had always been her weapon, but now she escalated to something dangerous. Somehow, through whispered conversations and her manipulative grip on the HOA, she had obtained access to his property. She was certain that once she got inside, she would find enough evidence to justify her crusade against him. Evidence that would humiliate him in front of the entire community and cement her power as the untouchable leader of the neighborhood. She glanced around, scanning the cul-de-sac to make sure no one was watching. Satisfied, she slid the key into the lock, her hands trembling with a mix of adrenaline and triumph. The quiet click of the mechanism echoed louder than she expected. With a push, the door creaked open. She stepped inside, ready to gather her ammunition. But the air inside the house felt different. Still heavy and far too quiet, her confidence wavered as her eyes adjusted to the dim interior. Unmistakable presence lurking in the silence. And then she saw them. 2 uniformed officers stood in the hallway. The key she held slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. This wasn't supposed to happen, yet here she was, caught red-handed in the one place she should never have been, as the officers shifted their stance. The reality of her situation pressed down on her like a vice. The house she thought she would conquer had become her trap, and standing in the doorway behind them, the man she despised the most appeared. Arms crossed, watching with a look that told her the tables had turned. The silence stretched heavier than ever, until the neighborhood queen realized she was no longer in control. And with that frozen moment, the stage was set for a confrontation the entire neighborhood would never forget. The HOA president's heart raced, her breath uneven as the reality of her mistake set in. It wasn't luck, it was a setup, and he had been patient enough to let her incriminate herself. The officers didn't need to say a word. Their silence was louder than any accusation. She could feel judgment radiating from them, a force that pinned her in place. Every movement she had made, the trespassing, the turning of the key, the smug grin she wore as she crossed the threshold, all of it replayed in her mind like a damning film reel. Behind her, the afternoon light spilled in through the open door. Neighbors were beginning to stir. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted, and curious eyes peered out into the cul-de-sac. They couldn't see inside the house yet, but they could see her standing in the doorway. To them, it probably looked like she was confronting the homeowner again, just another one of her usual tirades. What they didn't know was that the president's empire of intimidation was crumbling from within. The man had predicted this moment with unsettling accuracy. For weeks, he had watched her antics escalate from fake violation letters shoved into his mailbox to threats of fines. For things that weren't even against the rules, he had remained calm, resisting the urge to retaliate because he knew she was reckless enough to expose herself. They were his silent allies, waiting for her arrogance to cross the final line. Inside the house, security cameras recorded from discreet corners, their blinking lights subtle but unmistakable. A file sat neatly on the hallway table. Copies of her violation notices had been collected into a damning dossier. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that haste was unnecessary. Their presence alone was enough to dismantle the authority she had clung to for so long. The HOA president, once the self-proclaimed ruler of the community, looked smaller now. Her shoulders hunched, her eyes darted nervously, and the smug posture she always carried was gone. Outside, a murmur began to spread. Neighbors were stepping onto porches, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. they whispered to one another, pointing at the police car parked on the curb, its lights silently flashing. The sight of their HOA leader caught in such a compromising moment sent ripples of curiosity through the street, and word was spreading fast. The homeowner didn't need to say anything. His quiet, unwavering presence was enough. He stood just behind the officer's arms folded, his expression calm, but edged with satisfaction. The trap had sprung, and it was flawless. The HOA president's mind raced with excuses, strategies, anything to claw back the power she had lost. But nothing came. She had trespassed, fully aware that she had no right to be inside. And worst of all, she had done it under the assumption that no one would stop her. The silence pressed harder. It wasn't just the silence of the house, it was the silence of inevitability. She could hear the faint clicks of the cameras recording every second, immortalizing the moment when the queen of the HOA was stripped of her crown. And just as her panic began to spiral, a shadow moved across the doorway. A new figure appeared on the porch, one she hadn't expected, one that made her stomach sink even further. It was another officer, this one holding a folder thick with documents, the kind of paperwork that spelled the beginning of an investigation. The HOA president's reign was no longer just in jeopardy. It was unraveling, piece by piece. In full view of the neighborhood she had once controlled, and as the neighbors gathered outside, unaware of the storm about to break, the first cracks of her downfall widened into something impossible to repair. The sound of murmurs grew louder as more neighbors stepped outside. Some stood with folded arms, others whispered behind cupped hands, but all of them watched with wide, curious eyes. The flashing lights of the police car had already set the stage, and now, the sight of their HOA president standing frozen in another homeowner's doorway painted a picture they couldn't ignore. For years, she had ruled them through intimidation. She had fined families for paint colors deemed too bright, demanded residents trim their hedges to her exact specifications, and scolded anyone who dared to park on the street for longer than a few minutes. She had even bullied the elderly, issuing violation notices for weeds that were nothing more than wildflowers. Each family had their own story of humiliation at her hands. Now, the tide was turning. One by one, those families stood on their porches, watching the spectacle unfold. For the first time, the balance of power in the neighborhood was shifting. The queen of their suburban kingdom had been caught trespassing, and not by rumor or hearsay, but by the cold, undeniable truth of police presence and security cameras recording every move inside the house. The tension was suffocating. The officers remained calm, their posture steady and professional. They didn't need to raise their voices. Their authority filled the air without effort, leaving no room for argument. The HOA president, once the loudest and most commanding voice on the street, now struggled to breathe under the weight of their silence. The homeowner, standing tall, just behind them, knew exactly what was happening outside. He could sense the shift in the neighborhood, the way whispers were spreading like wildfire. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every single person she had wronged. He had triggered a moment that would ripple far beyond his own property, and he knew the consequences would be permanent. Back in the cul-de-sac, a small group of neighbors began inching closer, curiosity overriding their hesitation. Some held, their phones discreetly at their sides, recording the scene. The HOA president had often used shame as a weapon, but now the shame was hers, and the evidence of her fall was being documented from every angle. Her mind spun desperately. She had built her power on the illusion of control, convincing everyone that she was untouchable, that the HOA existed solely through her authority. But illusions shattered icily, and this one was breaking faster than she could repair. She wanted to scream, to demand silence from the growing crowd outside, but she couldn't. Any outburst would only feed the fire. The officer with the thick folder stepped forward, opening it slowly, each page a reminder of the walls closing. In around her, the documents weren't just about today. They were a collection of every grievance, every violation of trust, every complaint that had been brushed aside or silenced by her influence. They had been waiting for the right moment, and she had given it to them herself. The homeowner had been patient, methodical. He had spoken to neighbors quietly, listening to their stories, collecting evidence of her overreach. He hadn't needed to argue or fight her directly. All he had to do was wait for her arrogance to drive her into a mistake so catastrophic that no one could protect her. And now, that mistake stood in front of everyone. The crowd outside swelled. Children peeked from behind their parents, confused but fascinated. Retirees, who had endured years of nitpicking from the HOA president, watched with arms crossed and satisfied expressions. Even the families who once feared her most now stood taller, sensing the fear had shifted to the one who had caused it. Inside, the officers began moving methodically, inspecting the scene. The dropped key glinted on the floor, undeniable proof of her unlawful entry. The cameras continued to record. Every detail, every second, was being preserved. The HOA president, once untouchable, now found herself cornered not only by the law, but by the very community she had tormented. Her voice failed her, her excuses withered before they could form. The weight of her empire's collapse pressed harder with every passing second. The man she had targeted remained composed, figure who needed no words. His calmness was more devastating than anger could have ever been. He didn't gloat, didn't mock. He simply stood as the undeniable symbol of her undoing, a reminder that her reign had ended the moment she stepped through his door. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the neighborhood in gold and shadow, the murmurs of the crowd outside grew into a quiet roar. They weren't just watching anymore. They were awakening. For the first time, the HOA president's grip had broken, and the neighborhood was realizing that they had never truly been powerless. Her downfall was no longer just unfolding inside the house. It was spilling into the streets, into every whispered conversation, into every phone recording, into every neighbor who had once feared her but now stood unafraid. And as the police prepared to take the next step, the question became clear. What would happen when the Queen of Control was finally removed from her throne? The hum of the crowd outside swelled into a restless energy, the kind that spread from one house to the next until nearly every porch in the cul-de-sac was occupied. Neighbors stood in clusters, exchanging knowing glances, their expressions a mix of disbelief, satisfaction, and quiet vindication. For years they had whispered about how far the HOA president would go, but few could have predicted the sight now unfolding in plain view. Inside the house, the tension reached its breaking point. The officers moved with deliberate precision, documenting every detail. One crouched to pick up the dropped key, slipping it into an evidence bag. Another adjusted the position of a recording device, ensuring every word and movement was captured. The thick folder remained open, its pages spread across the hallway table like a ledger of judgment. The HOA president's composure crumbled further with each passing moment. The confidence that once carried her through countless confrontations had dissolved into frantic calculations that led nowhere. She searched for some foothold, some escape, but none existed. Her own arrogance had delivered her into the very situation she had spent years avoiding. The homeowner remained silent, his presence as unshakable as ever. He had no need to intervene. The truth was unfolding perfectly on its own. His patience had paid off, and now the entire neighborhood was bearing witness to the consequences. His calmness only amplified her panic, a reminder that the trap had been sprung with a precision she could never undo. The officers conferred quietly, their words low but steady. Their demeanor carried the weight of inevitability. This was no longer a neighborhood squabble. This was a matter of law, of trespassing, of abuse of authority. And as their decision solidified, the HOA president's fear deepened into something darker. She knew that once they acted, there would be no salvaging the image she had built for herself. Outside, the neighbors leaned closer, straining to catch glimpses of what was happening. Cell phones rose discreetly, their cameras capturing the flashing police lights, the tense posture of the officers, and the unmistakable figure of their HOA leader standing cornered in someone else's home. The evidence of her downfall was not only in police hands, it was in the hands of her neighbors, ready to spread across the community like wildfire. The officers finally shifted, their decision clear. One stepped forward, his presence filling the small space between her and the door. The HOA president's breath quickened, her shoulders trembling as the reality of the situation pressed down. She had always believed herself untouchable, that her title as president of the HOA placed her above scrutiny, but titles meant nothing in the face of the law. Her attempt to maintain control surfaced one last time. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and forced herself to stand tall. But the performance rang hollow. The officer saw through it, the homeowner saw through it, and the neighbors outside knew exactly what it was: desperate act. To cling to a power already lost, the silence broke with the rustle of paper as the officer with the folder handed it to his partner. The weight of documentation, of complaints and testimonies was now an official record. Her years of unchecked authority had been reduced to evidence against her, proof of her misuse of power. The door remained open, and through it the crowd could see enough to understand what was happening. Gasps rippled through the street as the officers moved closer to her. The sight was undeniable. The HOA president, the woman who had ruled their neighborhood with fear and intimidation, was facing a reckoning none had thought they would live to see. The man she had targeted stayed in the shadows of the hallway, his face calm but resolute. He didn't gloat, didn't speak. He let the moment speak for itself, knowing that silence was more powerful than any words of triumph. His stillness contrasted her unraveling, and the neighbors outside understood the symbolism immediately. The balance of the community had shifted permanently. The person they once feared was now the one trembling. The residents who once obeyed her out of intimidation now stood united in quiet defiance. The flashing lights of the police car reflected off their faces, casting them in a glow that marked the beginning of a new chapter for the neighborhood inside. The HOA president's downfall had reached its peak. The officers' movements were firm, their actions leaving no room for denial. Her intrusion had crossed a line too sharp to ignore. The documents sealed her history of overreach. The cameras preserved her violation, and the community bore witness to every second of it. The reckoning was complete. She was no longer the enforcer of rules, no longer the untouchable authority. She was the violator, the trespasser, the one who had been caught red-handed and cornered by her own arrogance. And as the officers prepared to escort her out, the neighborhood collectively held its breath. This wasn't just an ending. It was a transition, a moment that would echo in every future conversation, every HOA meeting, every whispered story told beneath porch lights. The queen of the HOA had fallen, but the story wasn't over. The question remained, what would become of the neighborhood now that her throne was empty? The sun dipped lower in the sky as the officers guided the HOA president out of the house. The once commanding figure, known for her loud voice and clipped orders, was reduced to a shadow of herself. Her steps faltered, her face pale, and though she tried to keep her chin high, the weight of dozens of eyes pressed her down with every step. The neighborhood had gathered in full force now. Families stood shoulder to shoulder on their lawns. Children clung to parents, and even those who usually kept to themselves had come out to witness what many thought they would never see. The flashing lights from the police car reflected in their eyes, and the murmurs spread like a wave. The president had been caught trespassing. The president had gone too far. The president was finished. Phones captured every angle. Some neighbors filmed openly, no longer fearing her retaliation, while others snapped photos discreetly. Within hours, the images and videos would spread across community groups and social media, stripping away whatever shred of influence she had left. Her reputation, once a weapon she wielded mercilessly, had crumbled into dust in front of the very people she had tormented. The officers maintained a professional silence, their movements steady and unyielding as they placed her near the patrol car. They did not rush, for there was no need. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation, and the neighborhood's watchful eyes were the final confirmation. This wasn't just an arrest, it was a reckoning. The homeowner stood in his doorway, watching calmly as the scene unfolded. He didn't need to speak or wave or call attention to himself. His silence was enough. The neighbors who had once pitied him for becoming the target of the HOA president now looked to him with respect. He had endured her attacks with patience. He had prepared quietly, and in the end, he had revealed her true nature without resorting to the same cruelty she had shown. As the patrol car door closed, a hush fell over the street. The HOA president sat inside, her face partially hidden by the tinted glass. But everyone could see enough to know the truth. She was no longer the ruler of their neighborhood. Her reign had ended not with more fines, not with more threats, but with the very law she had believed herself above. The silence broke into quiet conversations. Neighbors who rarely spoke to one another began sharing stories, connecting over their shared relief. They spoke of fines that had ruined weekends, threats that had caused sleepless nights, and small acts of defiance they had once been too afraid to admit. Now, the fear was gone. What remained was a community beginning to heal. In the days that followed, the videos circulated quickly. The footage of the HOA president caught trespassing spread beyond the neighborhood, reaching online groups, where stories of HOA nightmares thrived. Strangers from across the country watched in disbelief, commenting on the audacity of her intrusion and applauding the homeowner's quiet victory. What had been a private struggle became a public cautionary tale, a viral reminder that power built on intimidation never lasts. The neighborhood adjusted quickly to the absence of her presence. Meetings were no longer filled with tension and threats, but with genuine discussions about improvements that actually mattered. The weight of constant surveillance, the fear of arbitrary punishments, had lifted. For the first time in years, residents felt a sense of ownership over their own homes. They planted flowers without fear of citation, parked without dread of fines, and greeted one another with relief instead of suspicion. The homeowner remained a quiet figure in all of it, never seeking credit, never demanding recognition. He didn't need it. His victory was not in fame or attention, but in the peace restored to the street. He watched as the neighborhood transformed around him, satisfied that patience and preparation had succeeded where anger might have failed. And as for the HOA president, her downfall was permanent. The combination of legal consequences, public shame, and the loss of community trust ensured she would never reclaim her throne. The woman who once believed herself untouchable had been undone by her own hand, undone by the very arrogance that had defined her reign. The story of her trespass became legend in the neighborhood, retold at gatherings, shared with newcomers, and whispered whenever someone mentioned the HOA, but the ending was always the same. She had crossed the line, and the law had waited for her on the other side. In the end, the neighborhood was no longer a kingdom ruled by fear, but a community reborn from the ashes of her downfall. The people who once lived under her shadow now stood taller, freer, and stronger together, and the house she had trespassed into, the one she thought she would conquer, remained the silent monument of her undoing, a reminder that arrogance never outlives truth, and control never outlasts justice.